In this episode of Ideas, I talked to Drew Dudley about leadership, his TED Talks, what love actually means, and much more. Here's our conversation. Today we have Drew Dudley on the show. He's the former coordinator of one of the largest university leadership development programs in Canada and is also the founder and chief catalyst of Day One Leadership, where he works with organizations around the world to empower people to increase their leadership capacity. Drew, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, Adam, it's my pleasure to be here, man.
Is there anything else you can add to my intro to maybe give listeners more insight into your journey?
Oh, well, sure. I mean, I'm incredibly lucky to have this really cool job where I get to travel around the world and explore with people what leadership means to them and to their organizations and to their communities. And I think that's really important to me, the idea that, I don't teach leadership. Someone has said to me that you teach leadership. And I don't look at it that way. I mean, someone once told me that leadership can't actually be taught. It can only be learned. And so I kind of have embraced that idea that really what I try to do is get people exploring what the concept means to them. And hopefully I get people realizing that leadership is something to which they can and should aspire. Because when I worked at the university, what I found is that a lot of the students there felt that leadership wasn't something that was part of their identity or couldn't be part of their identity, especially those who were introverted, those who didn't see themselves as particularly comfortable being the center of attention. These individuals sort of said, well, leadership isn't for me. And I started to really want to focus on showing people that there is a form of leadership to which we all can and should aspire. And that really is where the focus of my work lies, is to say, the idea of day one leadership is, if you had the opportunity to go back to day one, all of your memories and wisdom and experiences, you still had them. But all of sort of the mistakes you've made, all of the successes you've had, and those of everyone else's were also wiped completely clean. And everybody got to start at the same place. And you had one goal: to build yourself into the leader and the person that you want to be starting here on day one. What would you start doing on that day, knowing what you know now? And that really, I think, coming up with a plan to do that and execute it, that to me is a personal culture of leadership. And I think that's something we're all capable of.
Hmm. That's so good. A lot of people look at other leaders and think that that's the version of leadership they need to go towards. Are you saying that each person has their own individual type of leadership that they will find themselves in?
Yeah, I think that I want to be clear that the type of leadership that we've traditionally celebrated, that which usually involves influence, involves a high profile, often involves money and titles, that is a form of leadership. And that's not a form of leadership that everyone is capable of or interested in. But I'm saying that there is other forms of leadership that I don't think are more or less. I think that's only one type, this positional leadership that we've often celebrated. I think that leadership is striving to act every day in a way that makes it more likely you'll have a positive impact on your own life and on the lives of other people. And I think if you're doing that, and I say striving to do that because sometimes you will fail,
Yeah.
and I say makes it more likely you'll have a positive impact because even if you do everything right, it won't always work out. But I think everybody has the capability to identify how they want to add value to their lives and the lives of other people, and to come up with a plan and execute that daily. And my argument is that that is leadership, because what you're doing is you're endeavoring to make things better for yourself and for other people. And I think that there has to be a balance between those two. If you just focus on trying to make things better for yourself, that isn't necessarily leadership. And, if you're completely selfless and you say, I'm always going to take care of other people first, you can't give to others and you can't take care of others if you don't take care of yourself first. So that is leadership. And saying, what is the role that I can play in creating something positive, in creating something that is going to improve my life and other people's? If you're doing it, you're leading. And so, yeah, there is a type of leadership that everyone is living. And I think the problem is we don't define that as such because we've sort of seen leadership as reserved for the few. And then we spend an awful lot of time trying to do the things and acquire the things that make us one of the few who could be called a leader. And we think if we haven't done that, well, we don't deserve the title. And so I think we need to broaden the definition of leadership because I think we're systematically ignoring a lot of it that surrounds us.
And I completely agree. That's one reason I wanted to have you on the show. Listening to your message, it's just so positive and uplifting, and it tells people that they can make an impact with their life. I just think that's a beautiful thing. And going back to what you said, leadership cannot be taught, it can only be learned. What can you tell us about this idea? Do you mean that the classroom setting is the wrong place to teach leadership? You actually have to go out and do it, like you've already mentioned?
Well, I think it's the right, like classrooms play a role in helping people explore leadership. But I think ultimately leadership is a very personal thing in that I think the type of leadership I talk about is identifying the values you want to stand for on a daily basis and then actually creating a daily plan to do so. So I think the classroom or sort of that, educator student type of dynamic can be useful in that you can help people realize that they're capable of leadership. You can demonstrate how that is true. You can help them identify what their core values are because most people don't know what they are. Honestly, if you ask people what values drive you or what do you really want to stand for on a daily basis, most people can't tell you. So I think the classroom or coaching or workshops, whatever the case may be, they play a role in it. But leadership in itself, like the actual practice of leadership, has to be done every day through interactions with other people. And the problem is a lot of classroom interactions are one way. There's someone distributing information or sort of providing information to listeners, and they're supposed to remember it and maybe use it, definitely regurgitate it later on down the road. But the practice of leadership is very much a two-way thing. Like I get asked a lot, can you be a leader without followers? And I kind of think that if you look at the world as comprising of, dozens, if not hundreds of interactions on a given day, I think that if you kind of look at it on an almost molecular basis, imagine we're all atoms bouncing around the world. Every now and then we're going to interact with each other and some sort of reaction is going to happen and we're going to bounce off in different directions. And I think if, as a result of that interaction, if the path of both people involved in it is beneficial or better off because of the interaction, then you've been both a leader and a follower in that interaction, right? Because you've helped somebody else improve the course of their day or their week or their life. And you've allowed them to do the same thing through the power of this interaction. And it's the same idea that sometimes atoms can come together and form groups that are then capable of interactions that they wouldn't be capable of on their own. So I think that the idea that a classroom plays a role, just like anything else, but ultimately leadership has to be practiced. It's kind of like yoga, right? They don't say that you're going to do, you're a yoga expert. You practice yoga. You engage in the practice of yoga. I think you engage in the practice of leadership as well. And you can't sit there static and just take it in. You actually have to say, okay, what is it that I want to stand for and what plan am I executing to do it? Now, a classroom could help you figure out you need to do that. A classroom could help you figure out what those values are. They could even help you create strategies for doing it. But you got to go out and do it. And everybody can do that.
So you've mentioned planning, you've mentioned core principles that people need to have for themselves. Would you say that that's a good place to start for those listeners who are trying to find their version of leadership in their own life, knowing what they believe? Do you think that's a great place to start?
Yeah, well, the idea of knowing what you believe is something that I found most people tremendously overestimate their understanding of who it is they want to be. Because I had a great piece of advice given to me once, which was when you don't know what to do in a situation, ask yourself, what would the person who I want to be do in this situation? And then do that. But what I found is that most people, including me, aren't really good at knowing who it is they want to be. So what I say to listeners is, imagine I had someone follow you around for a month out of your life and they see every interaction you're a part of, and that's public and private. They see how you interact with people that you really love and those that you really don't care much for, and how you interact with people that you don't even know. And then at the end of those 30 days, if somebody asks the person who followed you, what are the three values that person you followed stands for every day? What are the three values that they use as their primary criteria for decision making? If you've been the person you want to be for that month, what three values do you hope that person says you stand for? And I think that's where you start living your own leadership is by, and obviously those aren't the only values you want to stand for, but start by asking yourself that question. What three values do you hope to be putting out into the world on a daily basis that you want to be the foundation of your criteria for decision making? Because that's what values are. They're criteria used for decision making. So what are they? And over again, I've asked that question, and most people can't tell me. And inevitably, I get the same words if you give them enough time. They say, I want to stand for integrity. I want to stand for kindness. I want to stand for generosity or faith or family, whatever the case may be. But then whatever the first value that you popped into your head, if you're listening, if it was respect, for instance, imagine someone walked up to you and said, I'm sorry, English isn't my first language. Could you explain what respect means in the simplest English terms possible? And I found that a lot of the words we use to evaluate ourselves and that we use to judge other people when we think that they're lacking those things, we honestly cannot define what they mean. And if you can't define what something means, you cannot articulate a plan to get there, and you probably aren't going to celebrate it when you do. And so to start living your leadership, you first have to say, okay, pick one thing I want to stand for, whether it's honesty, generosity, kindness, integrity, whatever the case may be, excellence. Pick it and then say, here's what it means. And then you have to start planning every day to be able to do at least one specific thing that you can say with confidence, I lived up to that value today. And most people can't even identify the values, let alone create a plan to actually do something to live up to them. And I'm not saying you got to figure out every value you want to stand for, but I am saying start to create a process and get used to practicing saying, here's something I want to stand for, and I've got a plan to execute it today. And really my work is teaching people, one, a process for identifying the values that are most important to them. Because believe it or not, if you just ask people, they don't give you a very good answer. Like the answer they give you is actually usually not very accurate. They give you the values they think make them sound good, not the ones that actually matter to them. And then once you've identified those values, I talk about a process on how to actually create a plan to live them every day. And that if you're doing that, if you're identifying your values and you're living them on a daily basis, you could point to specific acts you did every day that you plan to do and then you follow through. I believe that's leadership. And if you start doing that effectively, you're going to find a lot of the things that we've traditionally associated with leadership, influence, respect, opportunities, whether it's jobs or otherwise, money often, and influence. Those are the natural byproducts that come to people who live a life that they've identified their core values and they use those values as their criteria for decision making and they live up to them every day. If you iterate that again and again, if you figure out who you want to be on day one and then you live every day as if it's day one, then you'll find that a lot of the things that we're taught to chase as goals come to you as a byproduct of doing that. So money, jobs, respect, prestige, and influence, those aren't goals in and of themselves. They're the byproducts that come to people who do a really good job identifying and living by values.
So important. It gives you a roadmap, gives you a direction to go in, and ensures that you're leading on a daily basis. That's really good advice there.
Yeah, well, to give you a specific example, for me, one of the values is impact. And I say, okay, impact is something I want to have every day. The definition of impact to me is creating moments that cause people to feel as if they are better off for having interacted with me. And what I do that is I use a question because questions are a powerful driver of human behavior. So I ask myself, I have to be able to answer this question every day. What have I done today to recognize someone else's leadership? Because in order to answer that question, I have to do something. I have to be able to point to a specific act. I can't just say, yes, I did, or no, I didn't. I have to say, here's what I did today to recognize someone else's leadership. And if I can answer that question, it's very unlikely that if I somehow find a way to recognize someone else's leadership, they won't walk away from me feeling better off for that interaction. So that one question means that I have to do something every day that's going to make sure I live up to that value. So what I really talk about is pick a value, define it, and then create one of these action-oriented questions that you embed into your daily life and work that you can't answer it without living up to the value. And so every day you have to say to yourself, okay, do I have an answer for this question? What is it? Okay, even if nothing else went right today, I lived up to this core value. That is how you start to live a life of leadership that's consistent with the things you care most about.
Listening to your message and seeing what's happening in the world today, and I believe, never before have we needed unity and peace and love. It seems like your message is wrapped in the idea of showing love to other people. How do you think love fits into leadership?
Well, that depends on how you define love. See, like a lot of my work is talking about how we use these words, these powerful words, and we judge ourselves and we judge other people based on how well we think they live up to it. But we often have never defined what the word means. And so my question back to you would be this. When you ask me that question, if I said to you, well, okay, love, the word does not exist in my language. Could you explain what you mean by that in the simplest English terms possible? What do you tell me?
Going out of my way to impact other people in a way impact to influence their life.
Yeah, but it's interesting, right? Like love, such a crucial, and because let's say, to be honest, I really believe in taking the time to be conscious about and deliberate about what we're doing. And in some ways, the word love gets thrown around in a way that's really sloppy, and in a way that's not deliberate, and in a way that's very vague. And just say, we have to add love, and all we need in the world is love. Well, what does that mean, right? And as part of my work, I had to sit down and look at a lot of these values that people used to define themselves and try to come up with an actual definition for them. And, love, we had a long chat about it, myself and my team, saying, okay, every value that we have out there, we consider values to be a commitment to yourself. All right. So the value you have is a commitment you make to live up to some desired behavior. So impact is, as a value, is a commitment to trying to create moments where you have people walk away feeling better for having interacted with you. And gratitude is a commitment to seeking out, recognizing, and creating moments where you identify the positive in your life. And we said that love is a commitment to celebrating the relationships in your life where emotion trumps rational thought. Because there are relationships in our lives that matter so much to us that it does not matter what makes sense. It does not matter what is rational. We are going to go with how we feel as a result. And that's actually kind of scary, right? To know that there are actually relationships in your life with people, with places, with jobs that have such a powerful emotional connection with you that you will do things that are irrational. You will do things that are not in your best interest because of these relationships. And love as a value is not being scared of that. Love is celebrating and embracing the relationships in your life where you recognize that emotion will hijack rational thought. And so it's interesting. What role does love play in leadership? I'm not sure, my friend, because love is all about irrationality. Love is about being open to the fact and embracing the fact that you are going to sometimes do what's not smart or what's not in your best interest because of how you feel. And celebrating the power that those relationships have in your life and knowing, and being okay with that. Now, I think leadership is about, in many ways, being rational and doing what's right and being very conscious. So I think in some ways, love isn't necessarily a huge part of leadership. I think that many of the things that we tie up in love or that love generates, I think that kindness, I think that generosity, I think that empathy, I think all of those things play a huge role in leadership. But love itself, I'm not sure. Not the way I define it. And I know that that might not be the answer you were expecting or the answer others are expecting, because it is just so easy to smile, lean back, put your hands behind your head and go, all the world needs is love. I don't know, because love comes with irrationality, and love comes with behaviors that sometimes aren't in the best interest because they're driven by feelings. However, I think that leadership does call for kindness and does call for empathy and does call for generosity. Those things, I think, are constituent parts or things that emerge as a result of love. But I think love just is too broad and easy a term because I don't think it gives people enough guidance into what they need to do to really have a positive impact in their lives and the lives of other people. I think we're better off being more specific about the acts that make up great leadership, which is not simply to say, I love and I feel and I am selfless. I think that it means identifying the specific behaviors that are behind adding value to other people's lives. So that's a long answer, I know, but I think a lot of my work is saying we will be more effective leaders when we are more deliberate about understanding and defining the things that drive us. And so using a word like love, which is so hard to define and means something so different to so many people, I don't know if it's really effective at driving behavior. It sounds good and it makes us all feel good when we say it, but I don't know if it makes a difference. And that to me is really what I want to focus on, which is I think it's far better off to maybe be a little more specific and a little less flowery because I think it'll lead to more beneficial behavior.
No, that wasn't the answer I was expecting, but it gave me something to think about, and it will give listeners something to think about. So that's what the show is all about, new ideas and ideas that make us think, and thank you for that. The word that I heard in that when you were defining love is prior relationship. So do you believe to show love, then you have to already have a relationship with people, and kindness is what you would show people that you don't already have a relationship with?
Well, it's interesting. I think it's really hard to show love, at least as I define it, without having some sort of connection with people. I think that love is a very powerful thing. I think it is a type of relationship, as I said, where how you feel trumps what you think. And I think that there are some times in life where that's going to happen right away. But I think being a little bit more conscious about what we mean by when we say love, and not everyone might have the same definition I do, but I think, yeah, it's really hard to lead with love. But I don't think it's hard to lead with kindness and empathy and openness and generosity. And I think that if you do that, it's more likely that you will form really strong relationships. But I think that it's nice to think that love is just instant and can be given. But I almost think that we diminish real love when we call being kind to someone that we've never met love. I think that's showing kindness. I think that's showing generosity. I think that's showing maybe empathy. But if you really want to celebrate what love is, we shouldn't claim that things that are not it actually are, if that makes any sense. Just because it sounds nicer or it makes us feel as if we're being loving. You can be loving, but that's different than love. So I guess I'm just trying to challenge, like, it just seems that so often we say things that sound nice, and it doesn't mean that we're actually behaving in a way that adds a whole lot of value. And so for me, I'd rather cut through a lot of that terminology and instead say, okay, but what does that mean? I think when you first meet someone, you can show the types of behavior that will lead to a strong, wonderful relationship. But I think to say, oh, I'm showing love to everybody walking, I just think that diminishes what love really is, because you're not. You're showing a warmth and you're showing a kindness. But love is something far more powerful than that you can share with a stranger on the street right away, I think. And some people will disagree with me on that. But I'd rather be specific and deliberate what I'm doing. I'm like, I wanna show this person kindness and openness and warmth. And maybe some people will be like, well, that is love. But I think it's not love until you reach a different level.
That's really good. And what you're telling us here that I'm getting from this is to become more intentional with the words we use, because words are important too. That's the other side of this.
Yeah, and the reason I say be more intentional with the words is because not because I want us to be parsing words and definitions as much as if we're intentional with what words mean, we can be more intentional about the actions that are associated with them. So, when I say I want to be clear on what I mean by love, that means I can take very deliberate steps to start to forge relationships and recognize when I've got it. If I say I want to be clear that kindness is different than love, it's because I want to say, okay, well, what does kindness mean? And how can I then show kindness every day instead of just saying it? Because if you say I'm going to show love to everyone I meet, you're not actually doing that. But it means you're lying to yourself. And then you don't actually have to back up your behavior. But if you say I'm going to show kindness or generosity or empathy, and here's what that means to at least one person today, then you're not lying about it. You could be like, no, here's what that means, and I'm actually going to do it. So instead of saying to yourself, I'm a loving person, you can say to yourself, here are 3 incidences today where I specifically lived up to my value of kindness. And I think in doing that, you don't have to say you're a loving person. You don't have to say you're a kind person because you're living it. You're actually doing it. And I think we spend too much time talking about who we want to be and trying to make us sound like we're something, as opposed to actually coming up with a plan and saying, well, here's what I'm doing today to live up to it. I remember I was in a meeting once at the university I was at, and they said, well, how can we make students feel as if we're more than just a place where they come and get graded and then use it to get a job? How can we make students feel that that's true? And all I wanted to yell at the top of my lungs was, make it true. Like, let's not sit here and try to figure out how to make it seem that way. Let's actually sit down and be like, okay, what do we do to make it an actual fact? Like, you could spend a lot less time convincing people something is true when you've actually gone ahead and made it true. That's the best way of doing it.
And the idea where that conversation came from and showing love was, it actually comes from the first time I heard your TED talk leading with lollipops. I guess it was showing kindness, but that also might be where listeners have heard of you before. And I know you've done some other TED talks, but that video had a huge impact on my own journey. So thank you for that video.
Oh, thank you.
I saw that in 2011, I believe it was. But it's also been voted as one of the 15 most inspirational TED Talks of all time. Talk a little bit about where that message came from and what you wanted people to hear through that TED Talk.
Yeah, well, for those who don't know, that TED Talk is the story of me being informed by someone that I had mattered to them when I didn't remember that. It turns out that a young woman who was going to quit school on her first day because she felt lonely and alienated and like she didn't belong was standing in line, and I wandered along and handed a lollipop to the person next to her and encouraged him to talk to her and give her this lollipop, and made a joke when I did it. And it turns out that little icebreaker changed her mind, and she never actually ended up quitting school, and she didn't tell it to me till 4 years later, right before she graduated. She said, this is the reason I'm graduating, is that I didn't quit that day because you had come and done this very small act that I actually didn't remember. And, you ask, what was it that I was trying to share with people in that message? And it's odd because it sounds almost cynical, but I guess it's really important considering what's going on right now politically, is that if you want people to listen to you, talk about things that make them angry or things that make them scared. Like, people will always pay attention if you're talking about things that make them angry or things that make them scared. And politicians too often tend to choose to make people angry or scared so they can keep them angry or scared, because people are a lot easier to control when they're angry or scared. I, on the other hand, and I think real leaders, talk about things that make people angry or scared, not to keep them that way, but to offer them a path away from fear and to offer them a path away from anger. And so the reason I shared that particular message is I sat down and I said, what is this audience going to be afraid of? Because if you're giving a speech or if you want to connect with a group, one of the most powerful ways of doing it is to start by asking yourself, what is this audience afraid of? And then figuring out what story you have or what part of your story you can use to help alleviate that fear and anger. And I asked myself, this audience, what are they afraid of? And I realized that most people are afraid of calling themselves a leader because it's been imbued with this weight of having to be a great speaker, having to be a very influential person, someone who is a big extrovert. And people are afraid that to call themselves a leader opens themselves up to judgment of people saying, of themselves and others, saying, okay, you are not worthy of that title. So people were afraid to call themselves a leader because they didn't want to seem cocky, they didn't want to seem arrogant, and they didn't want to be judged as unworthy of the title. And the reason I shared the story of one of the biggest leadership moments of my life, especially one I didn't remember, was for that very reason. I had had this extremely profound impact on another human being that I had no idea, not because I had the best grades in my class growing up, not because I had a whole bunch of money, not because I had a prestigious title, but because I had created a powerful moment of interpersonal impact. And people are afraid to call themselves leaders because they don't think they've acquired enough or achieved enough to feel like they deserve the title. And I wanted to let people know that if you are capable and choose to and consciously create moments of powerful interpersonal impact, then you are leading. Because I've managed to be a part of a lot of big things in my life and do a lot of cool things. But maybe the biggest impact I ever had on another human being was a moment that I didn't even remember. It was a moment of humor and kindness and genuine empathy for this person who seemed scared in line. And that may be the biggest leadership moment I ever had. And everybody is capable of creating those moments of interpersonal impact if they choose to. So I shared that story because I knew most people are afraid to call themselves leaders, either because they think they can't live up to the term or because they're afraid they'll be judged for doing it. And I wanted to let people know to not be afraid of calling yourself a leader and not be afraid of being willing to act like one and celebrate that.
It's great to talk to you and hear where that message came from because, again, it was a great video. And you have another great TED talk as well that you did. You talk about the game and how it has no winners. You go on to say that we shouldn't play the game. Can you explain what this game is and how people can opt out of the game and change their approach to not encourage the game?
Yeah, I mean, that came out of a student coming up to me, a business student, right after I told the lollipop story. And he came up and he said, I really like your stories. I've heard you speak 3 times. And I was really honored by it. And then he completely threw me a curveball by saying, like, do you want to know what's wrong with you?
Hmm.
And yeah, I was like, all right, like, let's have, who doesn't want a total stranger to tell you what's wrong with you, right?
Right.
So I said, go ahead. And he said, you never tell us how to win. I was genuinely confused. I said, win what? And he looked at me really disappointed, like I was talking down to him, like I was insulting his intelligence. And he said, this is a game we're playing. And we all know it's a game. We've known it's a game since the first time they ever gave us a grade. Like, why grade us if it's not to rank us and make sure the people at the top get something the people at the bottom don't get? And there's only so much money, and there's only so many jobs. And if I don't work hard and get them, somebody else will. And you're not doing us any favors by telling us there's some other nicer reality out there. All you really do, Drew, is you set us up to get destroyed in the game. And if you want to help us, clearly you're successful, clearly you have money, clearly you have freedom. You know how to win the game. If you want to be useful, tell us how to win that. And I started to realize that what he was reflecting is what a lot of people believe. And it's because it's what we reinforce through the education system, that there is only so much out there, that the end goal is money and jobs. And as a result, you should compete for this finite amount of resources. And that's the game. The game is that we are all competing for pieces of one pie, that anything someone else gets is a little less for you. And as a result, make sure you try to get to the top. Make sure that you get more so that you can accumulate more. Like, so make sure you get better grades and make sure that you go to better schools. It's all about how you rank compared to other people. And that, to me, I started to realize that there are no winners in that game. There are only people who have been beaten, because that idea that we live in a world of scarcity, which is the underpinning concept of that game, is one that really leads to a lot of the things that we're ashamed of in society. It leads to greed, and it leads to exploitation, and it leads to people building their empires on the suffering of other people. And it leads to the bullying that starts, in kindergarten and goes all the way up to boardrooms and workplaces. And that's because there is only so much money and there are only so many jobs. But there is an unlimited amount of self-worth. There is an unlimited amount of satisfaction. And there is an unlimited amount of happiness available to us if we can find a way to separate satisfaction, self-worth, and happiness from our job titles and from our paychecks. But we're never taught to do that. We are always taught that the key to happiness is freedom, the key to freedom is money, and the key to money is doing what other people want you to do so that you can please them, and they can give you more money and more jobs until you get to the point where you're the one who's in charge of handing them out. And not everybody has the same access to the resources in that game. And I genuinely believe that there are really no winners in it. And as a result, we need to stop having, especially young people, buy into it. And we need to stop encouraging our kids to play it, like, oh, work hard, it'll all pay off in the end. And, make sure that you outperform all of your fellow classmates. And I think we're far better off if we tell young people you should work incredibly hard to make your grades extraordinary, and then work twice as hard to make sure that they are the least impressive thing about you. And that to me would be education, and that to me would be leadership. But instead we teach, well, it'd be nice if you do that, but if you do that and nobody else does, you're going to be left behind. So yes, it'd be nicer if this wasn't the way the world worked, but it is, and you don't want to be one of those freaks who somehow tries to not play the game, because if you do, you're screwed. So that's the game to me. The game is the idea that there is only so much and that we are competing for finite resources. And that is true if we consider the most important resources out there to be jobs and money. However, if we look at the most important resources out there to be self-respect, satisfaction, self-worth, and happiness, those resources are not finite. Those resources, there are enough of those for everyone. But we need a certain critical mass of people to start buying into that before we can start making people feel safe, not chasing the things that they think will lead to satisfaction, self-worth, happiness, and security, which is money and jobs. And any quick look around at people with money, any quick look around at people who hate their jobs, even if they're really successful, will tell you that those things are not necessarily correlated to satisfaction, self-worth, and happiness. But because we teach people to chase them, part of the reason people are so unhappy, even though they have them, is because they were taught that once they get them, they will feel satisfied and full. And then once you get them, and you've given up so much of yourself and sacrificed so much to get them, and the promised satisfaction and self-worth doesn't come, it actually is even worse than before. Like it's worse than if you didn't get the job in the first place.
What I loved about that video is I think so many people are fed up with playing the game, and that message there is just so freeing, where it says you don't have to play the game any longer. So listeners, if you haven't heard either of the two videos that we just referenced and talked about, do yourself a favor and go listen to them. You will walk away with some great information and some applicable action steps that you can use in your own life. I know that McDonald's, Procter and Gamble, J.P. Morgan Chase, and over 75 colleges and universities have brought you in to talk to their teams. Is that the main work that you're working on today?
Yeah, a lot of it is talking about this process of, I call, operationalizing leadership values, because it's based on two pieces of research. One, that commitment, pride, productivity, and happiness within anybody in any workplace is tied directly to personal value clarity. So the clearer you are on your own personal values, the happier you are at work, the better you are at your job, and the prouder you are of wherever you work. So I talk to companies about the fact that we spend too much time focusing on what are the company values and not enough time helping the people who work there figure out what their values are so they can live them every day through their work. And the other piece of research is the power of questions, and that human beings do not like unanswered questions, and that if you give yourself a question, it is far more likely that you will answer it than if you simply give yourself a statement or a goal to chase. So to say, what did I do today to lose weight is going to be a more effective driver of behavior than I'm going to lose weight or I'm going to eat less. So what I do is I help people identify their core values, define what they mean, and then create these action-oriented questions. And I do that for big companies, and I do that one-on-one. And really, a big part of what I just launched is a website called Day One Leadership. That's DAYONE leadership.com, where what we're doing is, because some people have trouble figuring out, well, what values do I stand for? And then what does it mean? And then what is a question I could use? So what we do is, through a daily blog post, some video blogs, a podcast every week, we actually ask leaders of all types, if you could go back to day one, what advice would you give yourself? What value would you aim to live up to every day? What does that value mean? And what is a question that you would make sure that you answered every single day? So if you say, I don't know what values are core to me, We've launched a website where you can go and take a look at all these different values that leaders have identified, whether it's empathy or generosity or effort, and say, okay, what does it mean? What is a question that I could use? And so every day we're giving you a different example from a different leader of a powerful action driving question that could help you live a really important value. So that's where my work really is to get people thinking, yes, we can live leadership every day, but I don't want it to be vague. I want it to be very specific. And I want that to mean that you are creating these questions that are made part of your life and part of your work that you aim to answer every day. And the more effective the questions, the better you're going to be at living up to the most important values in your life. But because people struggle with figuring out their values and because they struggle with creating these questions, a big part of my work is helping people do both of those. And often by saying, here's a bunch of examples that other people have used. And that's really where I'm excited about now is sharing this online resource for identifying core leadership values, defining them, and then creating the questions and sharing the questions that help people live them.
That's such great advice, Drew. What is one last piece of advice you'd leave listeners with today? It could be anything, life advice, business advice, something that may help them now and in the future.
It's a really interesting question because I try to never to narrow it down to one. So I guess here are three things. Okay. First of all, I've already said, which is when you don't know what to do in a situation, ask yourself, what would the person who I want to be do in this situation? And then do that. And in order to do that, you're going to have to figure out what kind of values I want to use to make decisions every time. All right. Because that's what values are. The second piece of advice I would give is you're going to be judged a lot in your life. You're going to be judged on where you work, what kind of relationship you're in relative to how old you are. You're going to be judged on what you wear, on what you say. Feel free to dismiss the judgments of anybody who is not as happy as you are. Because if someone's not as happy as you are, they have absolutely no credibility in judging your life. And so what that means is if you can find a way to be consistently happy with the life that you're leading, you get to dismiss most of the judgments that people throw at you. And I'm not saying ignore them. I'm saying you could dismiss them because you can learn an awful lot about how to be happy from people who are not. And so, yeah, like when you don't know what to do, ask yourself, what would the person I want to be, and do that. Feel free to dismiss the judgments of anybody who's not as happy as you are. And whatever it is, the third one is this, whatever it is that you want in life, whether it's to lose weight, because I've recently lost 110 pounds, whether it's to quit doing something that like I quit drinking as well. I'm just over a year sober now. Whether it's you want to run a marathon, whether it's you want to learn a new language or come up with a new talent or skill that's going to make you better at your job, whatever this thing you want in life is, sit down and list all the ways you could get there. List all the products people have offered to help you get there. Come up with every single path you can think of that will lead to your end goal. And then look at that list you've created and pick out the one that is the longest, the one that is the most annoying, the one that's the most expensive, the one that involves doing over and over again the most unpleasant thing that you in your mind right now, and know that that's the one that's going to work. And so that's annoying. But coming to grips with the fact that whatever you want in life is on the other side of something crappy is a really important lesson to embrace in life, because it keeps you recognizing that when you're tired and when you're frustrated and when you're annoyed, that means you're making progress. But if it doesn't involve commitment, and if it doesn't involve sacrifice, and if it doesn't involve discipline, it's not going to work. And the sooner you come to grips with that, the better off you're going to be. A big part of getting what you want in life is figuring out what it is you have to give up to get it. And almost everything you want in life, you're going to have to give up something to get it. And that's simply the cost of doing business. And I think those three things are the three tips that I would give anybody. Figure out who you want to be so that whenever you don't know what to do, you can do it. Recognize you'll be judged a lot. Dismiss the judgments of anyone who's not as happy as you are. And know that anything that you want, the hardest, most expensive, longest path is the only one that's probably going to get you there. So those are my three.
Wow. Such good advice there. As the rest of the show was, I love this conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Last thing, where can people find your work?
Day1leadership.com. So that's DAYONE leadership.com. That's the website. And when you go there, you can find us on Instagram, at Day One Leadership, at Twitter, which is at Day One Leadership, but that's one with the number one instead of the word. So yeah, you can check us out on Instagram, you can check us out on Twitter, and we're on Facebook at Day One Leadership as well. So if you go and you subscribe there, every day you'll get another insight from a leader on what they do on day one, what value drives them, and a question that you could use every day to live that value yourself. And not every question will resonate, but I found that if you follow for a couple of weeks, you'll almost always find a question that you go, yeah, I'm going to add that to my life. And it'll start to make it better right away.
Awesome. Thank you again, Drew.
Are you kidding, man? It's absolutely my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you got something out of these ideas. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode.